This is Kevin Pruitt with another episode of Rising Tide Startups, and my guest today is Matt Johns. Matt, thanks for joining us on Rising Tide.
Great to be here.
So tell our listeners a little bit about Matt Johns.
Okay, so Matt Johns.
You got to tell them where you are first.
Well, I'm Matt Johns, definitely.
No, I said where you are.
Oh, where I am, where I am. So I live in Auckland City, which is in beautiful New Zealand. So probably about as far away from you as you could possibly get without going down to Antarctica. Middle of the day for us right now, which is a beautiful sunny day. So I've been living here most of my life. I've lived in Australia for a little while, but came back a few years back. I've got two adult daughters here, kind of 19, 21, pretty close to going on the next stage of their life, still a handful. But I guess I've got a relatively varied background. I'm obviously the CEO of Deliberat, which is a strategic consultancy. We help connect strategic decision making and with deliberately designed experiences for customers and employees. And I might talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But I've had a range of, I guess, interesting roles. So I was the acting chief strategy officer at Deloitte for a wee while. Obviously, I learned a few interesting things there. I've headed up customer experience consultancies based in Australia, covering the Asia Pacific region and a little bit beyond. I've headed up an employee experience consultancy based in New Zealand, across Australia and New Zealand. Going back a little bit further, I was in various senior management roles in the industry, so investment, finance, insurance, a few things like that. If you go back a little bit further, I guess my background gets a little weird. I'm actually an ex-cop from the UK, so I guess I took the most unusual step. When most Kiwis tend to go traveling around the world, they end up in a bar in London or some professional services consultancy somewhere, and I ended up as a cop in the southwest of England just because I could, which is kind of weird. So I was kind of lucky. I did some fascinating work in that, surveillance, informant stuff, a bit of undercover work, so which always raises a few eyebrows. And going back one step further, I'm actually ex-military too. My first job out of high school was joining the Navy, which we briefly talked about a moment ago. I didn't actually go to uni at all, and in fact, it's the best thing I didn't do. In hindsight, I initially went through a phase where I wondered whether or not that was a big mistake, and as I got into my early and mid 30s, I realized it absolutely wasn't. It was kind of forced me to learn things a slightly different way. Of course, when I was in the police, I studied and got very much into criminology, which I did pretty well at, but it taught me a lot about people, behavior, bias, motivation, things that really resonate and stick with me today. I've done quite a bit in design thinking, both with university and other kind of courses, and a whole bunch of stuff in management and leadership, including a few research projects, white papers, etc. But yeah, I guess that's a quick background as to who I am.
So, you're only 24, so you must be changing jobs every 2 months, right?
I'm definitely not 24 anymore.
So did you listeners, I want you to take a pause right now. Did you hear that unbelievable, track that he just outlined there, that he's had so many opportunities and been in so many different things? If this is not the Wikipedia definition of an entrepreneur, I don't know what it is, because we're never satisfied in a spot. It's kind of a churning, rotating wheel that's spinning all the time. So let's go back. I wanted to touch on this, the intent of it, touch on the idea of you being a cop. I could just picture that, you could be undercover because your accent was so different,
yeah, well, I was definitely not a cop, right? Because I was clearly not English. So,
right.
it's funny. It's one of those things there, when you do go through the process of buying whatever it is you're out there buying, whether you like it or not, every time you get searched, and they always think you're wearing a wire and you're a cop. Like, everyone thinks that.
So you watch too much TV.
Yeah, but it was exactly. But it was pretty easy to convince them that I was just a kind of a rogue traveler, a bit lost and down on my ways, and it worked incredibly well. So, and I learned some incredibly fascinating things about undercover work, which and same within the police. In fact, actually, the police is probably the role that I reflect on the most with the business we have now. Understanding people, we do a lot of qualitative research, and I'm really not a fan of surveys. I think surveys are just a red herring. They're a distraction from reality, and far too many decisions are made based on the outcomes of a survey without any real insight. So we place a lot of stock in qualitative research, and a lot of that comes from interviewing people in the police. My job, if you really didn't want to talk, was to get you to give me answers to questions I wasn't asking you, which is the kind of way we frame now our qualitative research. So
Yeah.
Ethnography, which is I guess a discipline in qualitative research, we want you to start talking about stuff, and I'm guiding you, but you don't really realize it.
So I'm going to try to backtrack and walk through this this timeline and ask questions as we're walking along. But so you mentioned you did not go to university, but yet
No.
you worked for Deloitte. How did you kind of get over that hurdle? Because I mean, normally that's kind of like a minimum barrier of entry, is it not, in a consultancy like that?
Yeah, but I wasn't hired as a grad, right? So certainly to my advantage is I wasn't hatched out of a grad bubble and brought up in this make-believe world.
Yeah.
And something I increasingly became aware of when I was at Deloitte is that the greatest hurdle for young grads and consultants coming into the business was simply their inability to demonstrate any real-world competency to the businesses they were trying to advise. The business that they're trying to advise can download that methodology. They can download the process. So how are you adding value again? That was a real issue for a lot of young grads, and remains. In fact, it's probably even bigger and more important now.
Right.
I was actually at the time head of direct distribution, effectively head of sales at a investments and finance business. And I actually don't really know why I got called, but I got called out of the blue, and I was asked if I was interested coming into to Deloitte, and my principal role was to guide and mentor partners and how to go about engaging meaningfully with customers, which was kind of a random role and request. And I'll be brutally honest with you, having not gone through university, I had no idea who Deloitte was. Have absolutely no idea. So when they called and said this really big company, I'm thinking, okay, like, I don't know who you're talking about. So I literally went in to this conversation pretty relaxed, going, I don't really know why you've called me, but sure. I know I'd written a few papers and stuff, and I know that probably had got ears pricking up. But and so my role wasn't actually stuck within a service line, as it were. So KPMG and PwC, they're all the same. They've got consulting and audit and tax and enterprise risk and all. They're all just sub businesses within the big brand. And so I never sat within any one. My role was over the top of it as an extension, essentially, to the executive. And so that role morphed pretty quickly into assuming responsibility for the chief strategy officer role. And I learned pretty quickly that because of the energy and time I was putting into it and my desire to deliver better outcomes for customers internally and externally, I realized pretty quickly that I had picked up probably more in terms of valuable insight about strategy than most of the young grads had, because I could reflect on experiences in the past and they couldn't. So it was an incredibly fascinating role.
Can we take a little bit of a right turn right here and just, or maybe just put the car in park and just camp on this for just a second, because we're going to have listeners that are going to they're certainly, for various reasons, they either decided not to go to university or were not able to go to university or whatever. What just give me a piece of advice or two that you think is really like salient for someone that might find themselves in that position and think, I am not qualified to do these roles. I'm not qualified to apply for these roles. How would you kind of, I don't want to use the word offset because I don't want to frame it as a deficiency, but the whole idea, how do you kind of round out your CV, or round out your resume, round out your portfolio with that education piece not being there?
I think if there was almost a single piece of advice I'd give, is to not get distracted and worry about what you don't have. It's to focus on what you do have. Now, if I was maybe 22, 23, 24 years old when I was kind of going through that exercise, that would have been a lot tougher, because there was nothing I could have reflected
Yeah.
on, other than the military. in a funny sense, because I joined, I think I just turned 17 years old. I was incredibly young when I joined the Navy, so I guess I had something to reflect on. But you often hear people worried about what they don't have, and therefore not giving enough time and energy focusing on growing and developing the language around what they do have, the things that they're passionate about, what they believe in, what they've been learning off their own back, what they're interested in, and what really gets them energized, where they think they can add value, where they've, the things that people have complimented them on the past. Something that you don't go to school for, and yet I honestly believe is the single most critical asset in business today, is the ability to clearly communicate.
Mm-hmm.
And no one goes to school or university to communicate. You come out with a piece of paper and can't communicate, you're in trouble. If you don't have a piece of paper but you can communicate, you're going to do better.
Right.
As long as you're pushing your thinking, you're reading, you're exploring, you're trying to understand, you're having good conversations. We're learning all the time. But I'd really focus on what people are good at. I've spent a bit of time with employees who have worked for me or consultants who have worked for me. And I definitely see this trait more prominently with females. I don't think it's a gender thing necessarily, but I found that females have certainly create their own ceiling and are afraid to put themselves forward, knowing that they probably don't have the on-paper skill set. Whereas traditionally a guy might put himself out there a little bit too early and is nowhere near qualified to do it, but will figure out his way.
Right.
So for me, it's
in the air.
Yeah, it's a little bit like that. Sometimes I think guys can certainly be found out pretty fast too. So I do like the idea. I think I heard in a TED talk years ago about, I don't remember who the speaker was, but not faking it until you make it, but fake it until you become it. And becoming it simply means that you better put in the energy now to become it. Don't just wait for it to happen. So if you're going to put the time and energy in, you're going to put yourself forward, you're going to assume that role, do everything you can to backfill the skills required now, rather than hope no one figures it out. Because that's, I think, what happens a bit too much.
I knew that inner voice that told me to stop on that question and just camp out. I knew that there was going to be some gold there that we needed to uncover that was hidden under the little dirt on top. We just needed to move the dirt around a little bit. And I really appreciate you unpacking that, because I think it's going to be somebody that is listening to this that is going to be right down their street. I mean, it's going to be exactly what they needed to hear. But so speaking of drilling down a little bit, so you and I are going to step on an elevator, step on a lift, how you frame that, and we're going to go up 10 floors. You got 45 seconds to give me Deliberat's elevator pitch. Tell me exactly what they do and what it can do for my company.
So Deliberat does two key things. One, it helps organizations to make really clear decisions at a strategic level about how it's going to position the business for success, and then translates that both as almost an extension to that, translates that into what it means for customer experience and employee experience, both of which we believe need to be deliberately designed, but are almost always left to chance. The three are connected. Strategy is about direction, clarity, clear decisions. The customer experience is the underpins the competitive advantage that you'll be seeking to gain as an entity, what puts you apart and what earns you the right to have repeat business, and your employees do it all. So disconnecting them, I think, is a fundamental mistake. I think I was actually talking to someone about this yesterday. In my opinion, strategy is not the responsibility just of the CEO. Customer experience is not the responsibility of marketing, and employee experience is not the responsibility of HR. All three are the strategic responsibilities of the executive.
And is there a learning curve to get kind of C-suite to understand that? Or, I mean, do they have it kind of much more departmentalized in their mind, or do they get it when you talk to them?
Most get it. They're particularly if there's a little bit of diversity within the executive. If they have developed a very narrow-minded kind of white male kind of almost elderly thinking going on, and it doesn't actually have to be just white males, by the way. So right. I've definitely engaged that old style thinking when there are different ethnicities represented, different sexes but they're still thinking the same way because they think that's what they should do to fit into this group. If
Mm.
that happens, it's hard because
Yep.
they just don't want to learn. They don't want to know that there's something to learn. They want someone else to just give them the answer so they can get on with it fast. But increasingly, I think you're seeing organizations recognizing that their responsibilities are more than what they might have done in their MBA. Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's just because somebody laid it out 37 years ago, it's possible things have changed and there's
Right.
probably a little bit more to learn.
Right. I mean, you touched on it just a little bit earlier, and I want to kind of circle back on this whole idea of just actually we talked a little bit off camera before we hit the record button, but the idea of how you're kind of leading your business in the current environment, that all the surrounding kind of financial trough we find ourselves in with the coronavirus, the COVID-19, and it just the global impact that's had. So what are you doing as a company, as a the founder of your company? What are you doing to kind of position yourself to be able to navigate these waters and cast vision for employees and things like that?
Absolutely eating our own cooking. We are firm believers in really well considered and methodical decision making around strategy. And there are a few steps that we take clients through all the time. The first is being crystal clear on what the problem is that we need to solve. So what is the strategic problem? COVID-19 is not the strategic problem. It caused the strategic problem.
Mm.
So it led to an issue with you. And it's usually something to do with a change in your customers' needs and behavior, or an impact on your revenue stream. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, or something going on with your competition. They're doing something and you're panicking about it. There's other things as well. There's regulations and all that kind of stuff that impact you as well. But if you don't know what your strategic problem is, by definition, everything else is just a guess and reactive. You're not actually solving any problem because you haven't figured out what the problem is. So we're really clear on what the problems are for us. We know that much of the work that we do is facilitation, and we know we're really good at it. We facilitate better thinking processes and intervention and guidance in room. Now, clearly, we can't do that right now.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's forced us to think about how we can continue to deliver value, but in a different way. So the first step is getting clear on that strategic problem, which we know now. And then do, again, what I advocate for a lot with clients. Once you know the problem, what are the distinctively different possibilities that you might consider to solve the problem? Distinctively different. You've got to create options. If there's one obvious issue that I find with organizations around strategy, is that they never actually made a choice. They never decided anything. They just worked up an idea and kept working up that idea, and then eventually created something called an operational plan. Then they call it a strategic plan because they like the word strategy, even though it's not really a strategy at all. But at no stage did they ever make any choices. So their inability to think creatively and give themselves options was a real issue. And so we've got options. We can think about, okay, what would that mean if we really utilize digital facilitation within that? For example, are we going to be running video-based courses and effectively paid by numbers, or do we facilitate one-on-one, or do we defer the work and get onto it later on and set it up for So it's different roads. And then the last bit is we really consider what would need to be true for each of those ideas to be a successful strategy. So what needs to be true in terms of in customer value, what needs to be true in terms of competitive reaction, costs, all those kinds of things. And so we've very quickly been able to get through a process of thinking, make some very clear choices, and position ourselves for what we're doing now to slightly pivot based on this current situation that's clearly going to roll out for a few more months yet.
So I'm curious about how it's like CEOs would view your service. Would they, in a time of crisis like this, would they view this as a luxury service, or they view this as a an absolute crucial, almost utilitarian thing that we cannot live without, or is it somewhere in between? And how are you I guess framing it so you're even changing their thinking if they're viewing it in your mind maybe possibly even wrongly?
Yeah. So, in my professional opinion and based on my experience, I don't think a lot of executives, including a lot of CEOs, even understand what strategy is. They've just said the word lots. They've got a lot of documents that say strategy on it, which must mean it's strategy, right? Because it's a PowerPoint deck. It's got 100 good pages in it, lots of interesting graphs, a whole bunch of hockey stick things where we're going to magically win one day. And on the front, it says strategic plan for 2021 or something, So I just think that many really don't understand what strategy is all about and the difference between strategy and tactic versus just doing what you're always doing. Those leaders who have at least, they either get strategy or at least appreciate that there's probably a lot to learn, will realize or recognize at least that getting support and guidance through a process of thinking right now to therefore create really good strategy is arguably the most important thing they can possibly do.
Mm.
And therefore, it's not a luxury at all. It's an absolute business and commercial necessity. The risk of not having one is massive.
Yep.
If you're just doing and reacting, you'll make the wrong decisions. You won't make any decisions. You'll run 100 miles an hour into a brick wall, or you'll burn people out. Or you'll just fundamentally miss the need in the market. You'll just get it all wrong. Just because you haven't gone, well, okay, let me just take stock here and go through a bit of a process of thinking. Those who don't necessarily appreciate it or certainly don't want to be told that they don't really understand strategy, to me, I think you're going to see a really fascinating change in business around the world. Some big brands, I think, will die pretty fast, and some kind of fringe brands will suddenly take over. And this is, I think, going to be a trigger for quite a bit of change. So, those established organizations who have done it one way for a long time and it's been making money, sure, but everything's just changed, and the impact of this change is going to roll out for years. It's not, we're not going to go, there's no such thing as go back to normal.
I
No
absolutely
such
agree.
thing. It's not going to happen. We just don't even know what the next stage is. But when you break it down, you can make some pretty good bets.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree more. I've spent a lot of time, having conversations, obviously online with colleagues and just friends about that very topic about, in the history of mankind, have we ever had a global reset like this?
No,
I mean, I'm thinking
no way
the
humans still existed at the end of it
Black
anyway.
Plague, Spanish flu. I mean, those had global impact, but did they fundamentally change the way we do business and the way we operate and the way we view each other and the way we interact globally? And it is a fascinating time to be alive, to see. I mean, I hate the fact that it's caused, that this is the cause and this is the result, but to see what is this going to look like, on this global reset that is about to happen. And so what do you envision? I mean, give me your futuristic, prognostication about what do you think this is going to look like in give me 12, 18 months.
Look, I mean, it could go down a bunch of different roads. I think, I really have a lot of, I put a lot of energy into principles behind customer experience. I think the experience of customers is arguably one of the most critical contributors to the ongoing success of a business. Not necessarily its first establishment, because you can just come up with a cool new innovative idea and it kind of goes wild for a while. But and one of those principles that I hold as probably the most important is to set and meet expectations. In which case you need to not exceed them, because exceeding them is to me a false economy. If you can do it, do it. Say so. Don't pretend that you can't and then let's dumb. So if you can do it, and just make sure you do it properly. So set and meet expectations. A critical part of that is understanding what the expectations are and what's causing those expectations. And clearly through this period, expectations are changing really fast.
Yeah.
Both in terms of the hangover from almost the accelerated speed thinking that's been going on over the last decade. Everyone wants everything real fast. The likes of Uber and Domino's, even, these brands have just changed the way we think about instant information and, getting it fast. So, you ask a kid a question, they Google it straight away because they can. When we were kids, you had to go ask lots of people and you got lots of opinions and eventually found a book if you could be bothered, or you just didn't, So the instant view is pretty fascinating. So some things people still want, and there's a hangover from that. But also on the other side, I think people are going to tolerate a little bit more of things that they might not have tolerated in the
Mm.
past. You know, I'm a really good example of someone who I don't really like buying things online because I like to touch things. I like to see what it feels like. I need to know what it feels like clothing, like on my body. Does it
Yep.
fit right? Does it look all right? Is it a bit scratchy? Is it a bit, you know, I can't tell from an image. So I tend not to buy much on Amazon at all, unless I've bought it before and then I'll repeat buy.
Yeah.
Sure, that's not new, but I think you're going to see an increased number of people be happy with that kind of interaction. The most fascinating part of this is what we're doing right now on a grand scale. People engaging digitally and feeling comfortable with it and still feeling connected enough to do that. I don't think people are used to it enough. And I think the investment in digital assets has been really underwhelming for a long period. It's been a deferred thing because there's been no urgency. The urgency is really obvious now.
Right.
If you're going to get together, you know, 30 people from your wider management team across the globe and you're seeing all their faces on the screen, in the past it would be, oh, you know, no, okay, so no, you go, no, you know, I think you've got the mute, you know, so it's just because people aren't used to it. The technology sucks. Somebody's Wi-Fi doesn't work particularly well, you know, all that kind of stuff. And you can see everyone. I mean, I've got headphones on right now, but it's you know, they just haven't got the tools. So this, I guess, things are going to change and that people are going to feel more comfortable doing that more frequently. In which case, you know, one of our biggest challenges in Auckland, for example, is vehicles driving into the CBD, which is where everyone works.
Mm-hmm.
I think actually that the what's going on here is that more people are going to go, because of this massive social experiment which is going on, actually really didn't need those people to come into the CBD, or at least not every day. Why don't, you know, 3 out of the 5 days in the week, they just work from home, run the call center, we'll give them the tools, they just interact, feel comfortable, make a cup of tea in their own living room, cool. And then come in once or twice a week so you still have that human interaction.
Yep.
Rather than, you know, it's got to be this way because it always has.
It's coming. There's no doubt about it. I mean, people hear that, you know that you've given a little bit of a taste of the promised land. You've let them taste this idea of working remotely. And if you
100%.
don't do it, they will quit and go somewhere else. And they'll find a company that they can make that transition toward. So
that's that connection to employee experience.
Yep.
So employee experience, exactly the same principles apply to employee experience. They just manifest in a different way.
Yep.
So that particular principle of set and meet expectations, you need to understand what their expectations are now. Their expectations is that they should be able to work remotely. Remember, because we did, and it worked and everything was fine. So why would you not? Why would you not have done that? I think that's absolutely spot on.
Yeah, and I mean, just think of just the rent alone that you're saving in renting, these massive buildings in the CBD. I mean, just all over the world, not just Auckland, but all over the world of just plant and equipment, and just the keeping the lights on in a cubicle farm, that you're trying to grow employees in.
Do you know that's actually a really interesting point, because something I've been fascinated in for a while is activity-based working, and from an employee experience perspective. I mean, employees are, organizations have had this wallpaper on in their boardrooms for years saying the employees are their most important asset. None of them actually believe it. They just see them as a cost mostly, right? But they genuinely are an asset.
But it's strategic to put it on the wall.
It is, right? Like, number one, shareholder return. Oh, that's inspiring. But, one of the most fascinating things about the physical environment that employees work in is that we have this massive swing towards collaboration and open plan workspaces. Everyone forgets, though, that the entire rationale for activity-based working was nothing to do with collaboration. It was to do with cost cutting. It was getting more people into the same physical space. And then they realized, well, that isn't particularly palatable. We better come up with a story for employees. So let's call it about collaboration and teaming. And it was just a load of BS. It's not real. And what I found, we conduct a lot of audits in physical workplaces. We do the same thing for customers. We do not so much, I guess it's qualitative research on site, but when you're watching people trying to work in a physical space, the most common thing that I see impacting them is utter and complete distraction all the time. Totally distracted. Even if they want to focus, they can't, because people are walking past them. They've all got headphones in, trying to drown out the noise. There's nowhere to go, all that kind of stuff. It's just, so the productivity, no doubt we're having terrible productivity because people can't actually do the work. You even get things where you've got little signs up saying, please don't disturb me. And then someone comes up and goes, sorry, I know you got the sign up. And just a quick second, just a quick question. So you know that thing we're talking about, is that okay? Cool. And then they're gone. And you're thinking, what was I doing again? And then they, so they just wasted their time, and then they start again and flick between screens, and now they're lost. And then just when they're finally focused on their screen, a little pop-up says you've got an urgent email, and you're like, do I read the email? So, if there's one thing about working from home, if you can find a quiet space, it's a new set of challenges, is that you don't have that distraction. Unless you have little ones running past you. Yeah, sure, that's a different kind of distraction.
Yeah, I could not agree more. And it is going to be interesting to see just the result of this. What it forces employers to have a global rethink and a reset to think, okay, how can we retain our staff? How can we put them in a position where they morale is high and output is high and productivity is high, and they feel valued, in essence, through this. But man, I could just sit here and just ask you questions all day long, because I mean, you're making me think, you're making me laugh, you're making me smile. I mean, all the emotions just to go along. I just love the conversation. But I do want to value your time. And as we're kind of wrapping up here today, I just wanted to give you a chance. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you just want to wrap up with real quick, and then tell people where can they find you online?
Look, online, our website is deliberat.com.au, deliberate without an E, which it was a mistake, and we're actually in the middle of changing that. So I guess in the spirit of disclosure, when we first created Deliberat, we were playing around with the name, and I realized that when I was I do quite a few keynote presentations around the world, and at least 2 or 3 times I got introduced as Matt Johns, the CEO from Deliberat. And I was like, okay, that didn't work. That really didn't work. Deliberat. Okay, so we're in the process of changing that. But right now, www.deliberat.com.au. That'll just be changing shortly to deliberatwithan.e.live. I guess what I did want to share, because I know one of the questions we were talking about earlier was about what people can be doing right now, COVID-19, the situation. I've actually been running quite a bit of webinar work recently with clients about business development, proactive influence, and getting the outcomes you're looking for. And of course, all of a sudden there's this focus on staying alive, but anyone who has a customer, which is pretty much anyone, in my opinion, if there's a single thing you can be doing for your customer right now, is prove to them that you understand what's going on. Consider what they're probably feeling, what are they probably thinking, and how is that impacting their behavior and changing their needs. And with that, what are you as an organization or an individual in a position to be able to help with? So it might not be what you're traditionally able to help with, but you might be able to proactively take a problem. That genuine desire to take a problem away proactively from a client, I think, is one of the most effective ways you can demonstrate to the client that you really give a stuff about them. And through this period, I think that the businesses that get that right, that put the effort into that thinking, who consider good ideas that could be shared with clients that are of value, that I'm not trying to sell, I'm just trying to actually be of value to you, those will be the businesses that earn the right to be successful when we come out the other side.
What a great way to wrap up today, and just really kind of tie a bow around a neat little package, the conversation we've had today. And Matt, I just appreciate your vision and the way that you kind of outlined this and walked us through this. And I know that you are certainly walking, your team through this as well. And
yeah,
there's fear even internally about this, and this really is a global issue. And I love the fact that you kind of touched on this and really in two or three different ways, and really kind of a comprehensive view of leading well and leading through crisis, and just playing your part in helping all boats rise in a rising tide. Matt, thanks again.
Cool. Thanks. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed the conversation.